This is the last of the videos I'm making from the course, and this one concerns itself with revision. What you see here in front of you on this first slide is repetition. There's three images of the same thing. These are just two copies of the same thing. This is what looks like a scroll, but it's actually put together on something that you've probably never seen, that goes back to the 40s and the 50s, called teletype paper. When I first joined the Army in the 70s, this is how we used to send messages from unit to unit by radio. You had a typewriter at one end and attached to a radio set that then would transmit a message for miles and miles and miles to another radio set with a typewriter, and it would come out exactly as it had been typed on the other end. Newspapers used to use these devices, teletypewriters, as did police departments, and information was moved around. This is way before we had something called the internet. What you're looking at here is an artifact that's connected to a myth about writers. Supposedly, the writer Jack Kerouac, who was a beat writer of the 40s and the 50s, sat down one day at his typewriter and started typing a novel called On the Road. And supposedly, he just started typing and typing and typing, and he started typing on these scrolls, and as he got further along, he would tape them together. And you can see in these images different places where they've been taped together. There's one here, one here, one here, as it goes on into infinity. So the story goes that he put all these things together, typed this novel out in one long, exhausting session, rolled it up, and sent it off to a publisher, and it got published. Nothing could be further from the truth, but the myth is so delicious that it's one that has stuck with us ever since. And I think for a lot of student writers, if you feel you can't write something right the first time, if you can't do what Jack Kerouac did with his novel, that somehow you're not a real writer. And that is a load of hooey. All of you are writers, all of you are pretty good writers, and all of you are going to be better writers by the time you finish this revision process. We're spending time here because what we're going to focus on today is this notion of revision. How do we take the argument paper that you handed in a few days ago, and how do you turn it into a revised version of it? And that's what we're going to talk about. Here's the assignment sheet. As you can see, it's due Friday, the 27th of July. And as I mentioned a week or so ago, this is a change from the dates that I originally had in the syllabus. I have to have it due by Friday so I can spend Saturday and Sunday completing your grades and getting those in so they can be submitted on Monday. So what does this portfolio assignment consist of? It consists of two things. The first is a revised version of your argument paper, and you can see that here. And then the second thing is a 500 to 700 word reflective essay on what you learned about revision. Okay. Those are the two documents that are required for this. Usually in a regular semester course, I'll require a third. I'll ask you to pick one more paper and revise that, but we just simply don't have time. And I think this is going to give you the kind of experience that you need for revising. Well, what does revising mean? I'll talk about that in the slides, but if you look here at the assignment sheet, it gives you some ideas. Apply everything you've learned about writing, revision, incorporating sources, argumentation, persuasion, logic, and the like to your argument paper. Basically, the entire textbook, all the work that you've done to this point should be leading you to this particular assignment. This is your chance to rethink choices in organization, choices in content, choice in the sequencing of the paragraphs, choices in your sentence structure and vocabulary, and anything else you think that should be changed or retained, because the idea here is to re-envision your papers. Make sure that you've accurately represented different points of view and that your own is clear, as is the points of view of those people who have alternative ideas. Okay. If there's problems in research and problems in documentation, let's say your argument paper relied on 3 internet sources, not the 7 total sources of the 4 different kinds that you used in your annotated bibliography, this is the time to fix that. Again, you don't have to use any of the sources from your annotated bibliography if you don't want to, but you have to use a minimum of 7 sources of the 4 different kinds that were specified in that assignment. 3 to 5 magazine or journal articles, 75% of which must come from scholarly or peer-reviewed sources. And if you still don't know what those are, go back to your annotated bibliographies and see my comments. 1 or 2 respectable websites, and then one other source. That could be an interview with an expert. It could be a government document. It could be poll data or survey data. It could be your own research if you did a survey on something, perhaps, which I don't think anybody did, but people do for occasionally. And finally, this is your chance to achieve some form of perfection in proofreading, grammar, spelling, and the like. Okay? So that's the paper. Take everything, fix everything, but the most important stuff are these big concerns that are up here. The reflective essay, a lot of times students have questions about this. This is 2 pages that just says, here's why I made some of the changes that I did. You don't have to say I took out a misspelled word in line 3 of page 4. Instead, you say, look, I really thought about this and I decided instead of having a consequence paper, I've decided what I really am writing here is a proposal. Or I switch from resemblance to definition. Or this is some kind of ethical or evaluation argument. That's the kind of stuff that should be in your paper. And if you find extra sources or you decide to take my advice or not take my advice, you should record that in this thing as well. Okay. In terms of the visual argument, I asked you to do that to be due on Sunday, the 22nd. So this is your chance to talk about that in a paragraph or so and say, was it helpful? Was it not helpful? Okay. And if you get comments back from your classmates, and you should get 2 or 3 of them, each of you should, by Tuesday, the 24th, then you should mention whether those helped you or not. Okay. And again, the whole point of this thing is to re-see your paper and to think about what that process is. Okay. How do you submit this thing? You create one file with 2 papers in it. The reflective essay comes first, followed by your revised argument, and then you just upload that to Blackboard. In the comments section, if you've been to the Writing Center, you can just say, I went to the Writing Center. And then you can also get extra credit for research work that you weren't able to do through Merrimack. Let's say you got a book from the WashU library or SLU. You can add that in here as well, but only if it's a book that's not available in our library. And you have to have at least 1 paragraph of your paper based on that. And the way to tell me that is just to indicate that in the comments section of the paper, or you can put it at the very end. You can put a little note. But I would just put it in the comments section. You got a Mobius book. Tell me what the book is, and then I'll be able to see it in your argument paper because, of course, you will have created a works cited or references page entry, and you'll have in-text citations to it. Okay, and you can get an extra half-it grade credit for that. Many of you probably know or should remember from the annotated bibliography exercise, you can use your STLCC 1 card at any other college library in the state of Missouri. You can walk in there and check out a book. So I would encourage you to do that. Some of you did that during the annotated bibliography assignment, and if you already did that and you incorporated it into your paper, then remind me that that's what you did because I won't remember. Okay? This Writing Center and Mobius credit are additive, so that if you do both, you could potentially raise the grade of your paper by 1 whole grade. Also, when you go to the Writing Center, you don't have to have the entire portfolio complete. You can take the argument paper with the changes that you want to make. You can take your reflective essay. You don't have to take the whole thing, and you get the extra credit. One of the big questions that students always have is, how do I grade this thing? And again, the major basis is it better? Is it fabulously better? Is it remarkably better? Or is it about the same? And so that's how I grade it. It's graded holistically. I put a very few comments into the body of the paper, and because we're done, you won't be rewriting this thing at all. And so then you'll get it back in some form, usually by Sunday is when I should have all these bad boys done. Okay, so that is the assignment sheet. Most of the time, students think of revision as just fixing the grammar or fixing the spelling or changing all the things that I suggest. But that's not how revision really works. And I thought I'd introduce you here to some quotations by some writers talking about revision. John Irving, the guy who wrote Prayer for Owen Meaning, The Cider House Rules, who's actually a wrestler as well as a professor and a novelist, says, half my life is an act of revision. Bernard Malamud, whose picture's up here in this corner, one of the great Jewish writers of the 20th century, says revision is one of the exquisite pleasures of writing. And I think that's true. The more I write professionally, the longer I've been teaching, the more I think that revision is really the fun part. Getting everything down on paper is exciting and exhausting, but revision, making something better, cleaning it up, making it look good, expanding things, taking things out, moving things around, that's where the fun is. Elie Wiesel, who's another Holocaust writer over here, you may have read his book Night when you were in high school. It's a fairly common text. He says this about revision: writing is not like painting where you add. It is not what you put on the canvas that the reader sees. Writing is more like a sculpture where you remove, you eliminate in order to make the work visible. Even those pages you remove somehow remain. And this is the image I really like, this idea of sculpture where you're removing it. To get to what you really want to say. Many times students will say, golly, Mr. Burke, you took out all this stuff in my paper. And what I usually tell them is, I'm taking the stuff out you don't need so that you got room for the stuff that you do. But many times what I'm helping, or I think I'm doing, is sort of sculpting your paper and removing excess stone, if you will, so that you can really see what your paper's all about. So I think Elie Wiesel is onto something here. Here's a couple of more writers. This is Dorothy Parker, the great woman humorist from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And she once said, I can't write 5 words, but that I changed 7, which is quite a challenge if you think about it. And this is the last writer we'll talk about. This is Naomi Shihab Nye. She's a little bit closer to you in age. She's in her 40s. She's a contemporary African-American poet and writer. And she says this: if a teacher told me to revise, I thought that meant my writing was a broken down car that needed to go to the repair shop. I felt insulted. I didn't realize that the teacher was saying, make it shine, it's worth it. Now I see revision as a beautiful word of hope. It's a new vision of something. It means you don't have to be perfect the first time. What a relief! And I think this is true as well. I think many students feel that when I mark a paper, or when any teacher marks a paper, that we're insulting you. What we're really trying to tell you is there's some good stuff in here if you let it come out. If you package it in a way where your audience is going to buy it. And so all the efforts that we put into marking a student paper is really designed to say, it's worth it. This is worth cleaning up. This is worth improving. Okay, so keep that in mind. By the way, the Jack Kerouac references I made earlier, there was a movie made of the novel a few years ago, and this is the poster from it. You can see who was in it. Kristen Stewart was in it, Sam Riley, Amy Adams, Tom Sturridge, had quite a cast, Kirsten Dunst. This, of course, is Jack Kerouac. This is his friend Neal Cassady. The novel was a sensation when it was published in the 1950s. But the manuscript wasn't what was published. Instead, he was rejected by a number of publishers, finally got it published by a small house who was famous for reprinting Victorian pornography, Grove Press. And it took a team of editors 6 months roughly to shape it into the novel that finally appeared. On the 50th anniversary of the novel, the publishing house printed that manuscript, that long loopy manuscript that I showed you. And I bought it because I love On the Road. It's one of my favorite books. And it was unreadable. It is absolutely horrible. You can't follow it. There's all these digressions and asides and sections that have no business being in there. And so you can really see, if you look at the 2 books, what an extraordinary amount of editing and revision had to go on to make this thing publishable. But it was worth doing because the novel is still in print. So it sells several 100,000 copies every year, and it still has the power that it did when it first came out. As I said, the idea that Kerouac just sat down and started writing and typing was a myth. About 20 years ago or so, some scholars were digging around in a library, and they found what turns out is the real rough draft of On the Road, not the typed version, but in fact a handwritten one, where Kerouac worked in pencil, and as you can see, even as he's going along, he's changing things. What's interesting is that this is in pencil, like I said, but he's not erasing. Instead, he lines through things so he can see what he's changed. And if you think about it, this is kind of the way track changes in Microsoft Word works, the way that I send comments back to you. So again, the point here is that Kerouac, this great beat writer, this crazy man that everybody said, oh, he's a genius because he just typed this thing and sent it off. None of that is true, except he was a genius, but he had to do it the hard way, just like you do, just like I do. He had to start off with a crappy first draft, and he had to revise it and revise it over and over again. And even when he was finished or thought he was finished with it and sent off his typescript, that scroll that I showed you at the beginning, it still required revision. Lots of revision, lots of work until it was finally something publishable. All published writers have the same issues that you do. They follow the very same process. They have exactly the same relationship with editors that you might have with me or another teacher, and they all run into the same kinds of problems that you do. There's no magic bullet, and just because they've been doing it forever doesn't mean that they find it any easier. Okay. Most writers say that they do about 11 drafts. When we survey college students, we find that the average is 2.5, maybe 3 at the most. Most writers say that they spend the majority of their time revising, not drafting. It's about a 70-30 revising to drafting or 80-20 revising to drafting rule. And most writers work with editors. Most writers work with multiple editors sometimes until they get their book done. I have a friend of mine who's a Merrimack grad who's an author. She's working on her second book now, and she's also my dentist. And she's been very successful, been published, and she's working with an editor who's worked with her before to clean up her work. And she's to the point now where she's starting to make the changes that the editor suggested. And she's asked me if I would take a look at those changes to see if I think they make sense. When you're starting this process, how should you go about it? Most students will start with, oh, I got to fix a spelling or change this comma to a period or whatever I told you to do. Don't start there. Instead, begin with the big things. Think about what exactly you want your paper to do. What's its purpose? Who's the audience? And what's the best structure for that audience? Then take a look at my comments on content and see where I think there are holes that need to be filled. Part of the visual argument assignment is to help you identify those holes as well. Third thing to think about is make sure that you've got the right number and type of sources and that your documentation is straight. Then you can edit sentences individually and then proofread, proofread, proofread. And I'll talk about each of these elements in turn. Okay, where do you start? Purpose, audience, and structure. Do the big things. Think about who you're writing to, think about why you're telling people this stuff, and what's the best way to move them in the direction that you want them to go. That's probably the best advice I can give you, is to start with these 3 things and then work your way slowly into making the corrections that you see that I think you should make or that other people have pointed out to you. Because if you don't get this stuff right, then it doesn't really matter. All the rest of your paper is just not going to work. Okay. By the way, this is an image of the amount of drafting some of the most famous hands in America have done. These are President Barack Obama's changes to a speech. He had a number of speech writers like most people in Washington do, and so the type stuff is what they agreed to, and now he's making changes by hand. He's left-handed. And you can see the changes to the changes that he's made and some of the changes that he's made that he then crosses out. So this is the kind of revision that he does. You're going to find that this is pretty much the kind of revision you're going to be doing. And just so you get an idea, this is the kind of things that Donald Trump does. He's not really much of a reviser because he's not much of a writer. His staff writes his speeches, and then he tends to ad-lib when he speaks in public. And sometimes that gets him into trouble, and sometimes it doesn't. But he's a person who is very confident in his ability to project what he wants to project to people without necessarily revising and parsing every word. And obviously it's led him to the current position that he holds now, so he must know something that the rest of us don't. When you're thinking about, purpose, audience, and structure, these are the kind of things you got to think about. If you've got a hostile audience, let's say you know this because you did some audio analysis, do you use a dialogic or Rogerian kind of argument? If it's a neutral audience, do you use a traditional multi-sided or that classical 7-part argument? If you have an uninformed audience, maybe a problem solution paper would be worthwhile. Go back to the handout if you're not quite sure what to do that's posted to Blackboard in week 5 or week 6 that talks about argument organization. Okay, and then don't disregard the comments that your classmates make on the visual argument. You may very well find that they'll give you some insights into where they think you should go in terms of revising the structure. And of course, you can always come and see our folks in the Writing Center as well during the week. I know that they're not as available as you might like them to be, but it's worth making the time to drop in. They're open 10 to 1 or 3 to 6 every day, Monday through Thursday, and you should drop in and see them and see if you can get some help. This is kind of a cartoon about revision. Don't get so attached to a paragraph or an example that you can't get rid of it if you find out that you really don't need it. This is my bad habit. I tend to spend a lot of time writing the first sentence, and then no matter what, I won't change it. Every sentence underneath it I might revise 20, 30 times. Well, maybe 10 or 15. But the first sentence I usually don't change. And so it's like I've kind of designed a perfect radiator cap. And then underneath it, I've driven a car, and maybe it fits and maybe it doesn't. It's a really bad habit I have. But I suffer from this revision angst. If I like a sentence, then I'll jiggle everything around to try to keep it. And sometimes that's just not a good idea because I'm in love with a sentence, not with why that sentence is there or what it's doing. So after you do that, after you get the purpose, audience, and structure, then go take a look at my comments. Look at the organization of the paragraphs and see if they're in the right place. Look around and say, well, internally in this paragraph, do I have a topic sentence that really makes sense for this particular paragraph? Should I move it around? Should I break this paragraph in two? Should I add another example? Things like that. And the nice thing about computers is you can shift things around without making any permanent changes. It's not like you have to cut and paste stuff and glue it back together. But I would save your individual revised sections in individual files, not just keep using the same file name over and over again. Because in revision 5, you might suddenly realize that there's something from revision 3 that you took out in revision 4, but now you'd like to have it back. And so you don't want to lose anything. You don't want to throw anything away. And something a lot of students don't know or they don't remember to do is that when you do your visual arguments, many of you have gathered charts and graphs and images from Google Images like most of us do. What I would do is see if there are places you can put that into your paper. See if you can make it a graph do something for you in your paper that might be able to let you take out a paragraph of explanation because it's just easier to read and easier to see. So don't be afraid to put images into your revised argument paper. Again, we've talked about the source requirements. This just reminds you that what you need to have. Do I fail you if you don't get all these? No. But it might hurt your paper in the sense that there's sources of information you haven't included. And maybe what that means is you just don't know enough about your topic and about how other people feel about it in order to make an informed judgment about what to include, what organizational model to use, who's your audience, to answer questions like that. This is stuff I've talked about before, and I mention in a lot of papers. Don't just quote other people's assertions. Instead, include why they say what they say. Look in their essays or their articles or their sources and see why they make the claims that they do. In most of your papers, if I ran into that, I put some comments in there and say, we need some backup data here. So when you see that, this is what I mean. It's not enough just to say, Mr. Smith found X. Well, how did he do that? What were the results? Things like that. That's the kind of stuff that adds to your appeals to logos. And of course, don't plagiarize. As you can see, I've been playing with the transitions in PowerPoint. So we've done the big stuff, then we do the intermediate stuff, moving paragraphs around and rethinking paragraphs and sentences within those paragraphs and the order of the sentences in those paragraphs. Now what? Well, this is the editing part. Look at every single sentence. Take out the words that you don't need, leave in the words that you do, and make sure that things like your verb tenses, subject-verb agreement, person, and number are correct and that they're consistent. Okay. But before you get to that point, one of the things to think about is, why is this sentence here? What's its function? Is it, go back to the triac model we talked about before and say, is this a topic sentence? Is this information or analysis sentence? Is this some kind of transition or conclusion? What is the function of this sentence? And is that the right sentence for this particular place? And then think about length and content. And that's not length of paragraphs, but length of a sentence. Do you use a long sentence or a short sentence? And I've given you some ideas about how to do this. When do you use long? When do you use short? And then take a look at the changes that I suggest in your paper, some of the edits that I put in. You're welcome to disagree with them. You're welcome to ignore them completely. But at least consider them and think for a minute, well, if I took this out like Burke wants me to, is this going to make the paper better or worse? Is it going to be easier for the audience to understand? And don't fall into the revision angst trap where you think, oh, this is the best sentence I've ever written. I just can't get rid of it. Because in all likelihood, you probably could. After that, think about your opening and closing paragraphs. And think about, is this the best way to open? Is this the best way to close? Should I switch those around? Should I write a different opening or a different closure? Some people start with the opening and work their way to the end. Some people start in the middle with the body paragraphs, and once they're in sequence, then they can revise their opening and closing. By the way, if you do start with a story in the opening paragraph, make sure that you bring us up to date at the end in the last paragraph. That helps unify an essay, and it also answers the questions that audiences might have. Pearson Writer, by the way, has a sentence level editor in it that will help you with some of the editing function, but it won't do anything more than that. It looks at one sentence at a time. It won't say this paragraph is too long or too short or it's in the wrong place. All it's going to do is look at stuff that's within each sentence one at a time. But it can be a useful tool to find things you wouldn't see otherwise. I would use that at the very end when you're doing proofreading. The very last thing, that's when you should use that Pearson Writer writing review function. We've talked about this a million times. Just make sure that your documentation is consistent. There's handouts on Blackboard, there's sample essays, and you can see how documentation is supposed to be done. At this point, most of you are competent at it, but you don't always remember what to do. So just review it, make sure that it looks like the sample essays that are in our textbook or the sample essays that are on Blackboard. What do we do last? We proofread. There's a handout I've posted in a weak area called Notes on Sounding Like a Smart Person, and it's kind of a list of things that I've seen students do over the years that get in the way of the message that they want to send. What I would recommend is you get your paper to the point where you're happy with it, and then print it out, and then go through it line by line with a pencil. I would even recommend when you're doing that, you read it out loud. Things will sound different when you read it out loud than they do when you read on the page. If you can't see your own mistakes, start with the very last sentence, cover up the rest of the paper with a sheet of paper or something, and then work your way out from the last sentence to the first. And I guarantee you'll find errors in there that you wouldn't see any other way. I used to use that with my football and lacrosse players at West Point. Worked like a charm, but it's tedious. It's a lot of work. Okay. You can always give your paper to somebody else to look at, somebody you trust, maybe a parent, a friend, a spouse whose judgment you trust. As one of my professors in college used to say, you gentlemen should find a lover who can spell. And I think that's reasonably good advice. So after you proofread it once, make the changes, save it, and then print it out again and let it sit. Come back to it in an hour, come back to it overnight, and proofread it a second or a third or a fourth time. And I guarantee every time you'll do this, you're going to see errors that you didn't see before. And then when you're finally finished, you can print it out one more time, make sure that you have no more changes to make, and then go ahead and assemble everything into one file where you have your reflective essay first and then the revised paper after that, and then submit the whole thing as one file. Final slide. This is not me in second grade. It's an image I found in Google Images, but I kind of like it. Okay, so I think revision is fun. I think writing is fun. I wouldn't take it as seriously as this poor kid's face would suggest, but I certainly would put the effort in to improve it, because that's where the fun part really is, seeing if you can do something better than you did before. Writing is just like training for a sport. Okay, there's a point at which it's tedious and boring and you got to show up for practice and it's a hot day and coach is yelling at you, and then you're in the game and you forget all that and all you're doing is concentrating on performance. That's what the portfolio is. In the semester, we've done a lot of different things, and now we're finally at the big game. Okay, and you're ready to play. I have every confidence in every one of you that you're going to do fine on this assignment, and I'm looking forward to reading your portfolios.